This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
These people are in very high positions, yes.
I almost was thinking because I had some whiff of the sort of susness around the Theremin or the crazy history around it. So I kind of had almost thought I was surprised that you didn't have the Theremin in mind when you were thinking of this episode, because that was the first thing that I had thought of, that we can talk about the Theremin.
Yeah, I mean it was somewhere in my mind, but honestly the pretty much the extent of what I knew about it is that this was a Soviet invention, effectively. This is from Leon Theremin, or Lev Theremin, as he was known, in Russia. He was a young man, kind of a gifted child, like a child prodigy who, went into school for engineering and invented this instrument that, everybody recognizes it. It has an extremely particular kind of sound to it, right?
Yeah.
And most people recognize it from horror movies from the 20th century, particularly older horror movies. I'll probably drop audio throughout this episode, but the woo, that spooky ET sound. The sound that is actually more than anything identified with aliens for whatever reason. It is that UFO. I mean, synthesizers in general have been associated with aliens and ETs.
Yeah, that's a
whole nother thing that's fascinating
question.
about it.
Why do we associate the Theremin with aliens?
Well, I think if you're talking about
who, where does that first come from? Who first used that spooky UFO sound?
I don't know, but I would almost suspect that the extreme prevalence of theosophists and spiritualists around a lot of these early technologies, and the kind of even the necrophone thing from Edison, and maybe there was some overlap with sort of medium, seance, clairvoyant type of stuff, and maybe using these or at least, I don't know, being interested in these instruments, that maybe there was an association between spooky seance or whatever. But on the other hand, that might be kind of a stretch.
Looking it up on Google, apparently, this is just the first thing that came up, but it seems believable. Actually, it was the same guy who had conducted live music for the famous War of the Worlds Halloween radio broadcast, was asked to do the score for The Day the Earth Stood Still, right? Super groundbreaking alien movie.
The biggest boomer psyop of all time.
Yeah, and then he was the one who decided to use a theremin in that score, and ever since, theremin equals aliens.
I guess that makes sense. I knew that there had to be a Hollywood reason why, and that movie is cited as the big one that involves the theremin. Though, I mean, I've seen posters and stuff of theremin putting on concerts and presentations back in the 20s, and I forget the exact terminology they used, but it was Leon Theremin and the ethereal instrument and stuff like that. So they were already calling it kind of ethereal, or it had a spooky vibe to it that just comes from, that's interesting to me though, is just with a guy standing on stage playing it. And, maybe you could say it's what he chose to play, but I think he was playing classic Russian compositions and things like that, that there's something innately about the sound that strikes
Yeah.
people as otherworldly and like spooky, which
Yeah.
is fascinating to me.
I feel like
why?
maybe
You know?
maybe it's that because what I think it also sounds like, another spooky sound is Calliope music, right? Calliope music is pretty spooky. It has almost kind of like a woodwind quality to it. And, I feel like maybe it's because, the aether, like the wind is like spooky. The wind can be spooky because the wind's an invisible
wind does
force
whistle.
that moves things. Yeah, the wind whistles, Calliope is like, pan pipes, right? So, yeah, that's the best I could do. I don't know. Other than that,
No,
I don't
it's
know why
true,
this
it's
really
true.
sounds
I wonder-
spooky, but like we think of like desolate, like windswept, lonely places where like, we're vulnerable and like
Or think about like
the
a
sound
like
of
a wolf.
caves and
Think of a
grottos.
wolf howling in the distance in a forest at night. Like
yeah, exactly.
ooh, like that's dangerous. Like there's a fucking wolf
Yeah.
howling out there. So maybe there's something deep. I mean, that's what I'd almost like to, as we go deeper into this, like I haven't been able to find so far really some like hardcore. I want some like MK Ultra documents about like what kind of sounds do what to people kind of thing, because obviously Ledbetter is kind of saying it, that there are some frequencies that kind of elevate you and are good, and then other ones that are like dissonant. It's almost like a proto LaRouche argument that, 440 hertz music like psyops you or mind war.
It reminds
So, I
me
mean,
of Aquino's Diglocka theories about like alpha waves or whatever that will make people more receptive to Hitler's peace plan. Like, but
he was totally into that, and his
Yeah.
mother did work in radio, so
Yeah, true.
interesting. But okay, so Lev Theremin,
And she was the music person, right? She was. Yeah,
yes, she was a big music person. In fact, I wonder if she was involved in any, like, definitely like sponsoring some of these like avant-garde composers to come through San Francisco and things like that. Like I mean, she was a huge Wagner fan, which could cut a few different ways, but she was definitely into classical music.
Well,
and
that's like one of
arguably-
those obscuring things where it's like, oh, it could cut like, yeah, because like the futurists were against Wagner or whatever, so like, oh, they were against Wagner, so that means they weren't fascist or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not what it means. Like, it's not. Yeah, it's like that type of fucking thing. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make you a fascist that you like Wagner, I guess. Wagner was incredibly fascist, or at least
I
fashy,
mean-
anti-Semitic, raving maniac, idolized famously by many fascists.
That scene from Apocalypse Now is pretty fascist if you think about it. Like for half a second, it's pretty
Yeah.
fascist. Like
I
they're
mean-
just blowing up people, blasting it.
Definitely.
Like using it as a psyop, like straight out of Colonia Dignidad. Very sus. But Theremin, or Leon Theremin, okay, first of all, this guy's life story is so interesting. Like, I had no idea that he got kind of caught up in like everything that he did. But he's almost like a Forrest Gump, like composer of like the Soviet Union. Like he has crazy stories, and he also lived a very long life. He died, I think, in 1993. So he like survived he grew up like, and he was a teenager when the Russian Revolution happened, and then he died like a couple years after it collapsed. But my God, where to begin? Because I did find one book about him that was like written by a friend who interviewed him for years. But I have to say, like a lot of these sources about Soviet experimental music and electronic music and shit are like so infuriatingly like anti-Soviet that I'm not even gonna like read from them.
Okay,
Like,
all right.
it just like the Soviets enslaved everybody, and like everybody had to like die and go to a gulag and like blah blah blah, and like anybody that did anything remotely creative got like shot, and like one of them is there's I think Z music or the sound of Z, Sound in Z, experiments in sound and electronic music in early 20th century Russia, which I was like, oh, cool. And you can find a PDF online for free. And I'm like, oh, this is base. And then I saw that like at the front of the book, it's like, this is dedicated to like freedom fighter Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And I'm like, oh God, like, what the fuck is this? And it's just like, it's literally just like frothing at the mouth. Like it has like scary quotes from like Vladimir Putin sprinkled throughout it as like, a
What?
state
That's
only
weird.
need to hit you once. Like it's so fucking weird.
Wait, why does it have quotes from Putin? That doesn't seem like that
Just
would be
because,
relevant.
so Russians be Russianing, like that, it's that kind of thing. But I have to say, like, I think there's a lot of ideological contention over the career of Leon Theremin, because like this is where we start to really get cooking with like the development of electronic instruments crossing over into like geopolitical rivalries and like espionage. So Leon Theremin, and maybe to illustrate this in the most compact way possible, maybe we'll start with the man himself being interviewed in August 1991 when he was invited, like months before the Soviet Union dissolved, to come to like a kind of an event in his honor at Stanford University, which is put on by like all of these like electronic music heads. And so while he was there, he was interviewed by somebody we'll talk about soon, the inventor of like the analog synthesizer, basically Robert Moog, and I guess Olivia Mattis, who was a journalist. And he gave this interview with them, which was like refreshingly different than what I kind of expected him to kind of talk about. So first of all, actually, I just want to say for anybody that like doesn't know, have you ever seen a theremin, like live, Khalid?
No, I've definitely not seen one live, or like I haven't seen a theremin concert. Maybe I've seen a theremin like in a museum or something, but I've never seen a theremin concert. I mean, not like it where it was like the main, like a solo theremin performance.
Yeah, which is very rare these days. Because it never really broke out of being like a novelty instrument ultimately. But I actually got the chance to, I remember going over to like a friend's place, like when I was like in college or something, and somebody had brought over a theremin, and like I got to fuck around with it for a little while, and like, I mean, I wasn't very good at it, but it's a fascinating instrument. Like it feels sci-fi because all it is, it's like, it's kind of this box, like this long little box that's on like a stand, and has a kind of like a beam, like a metal bar sticking up, and then you play it by just manipulating your two hands, in the field, like between the bar that's sticking up and like the box, and you can control the pitch and the amplitude, like the volume, with each hand, and so
it's very cool. Yeah, and it is kind of like a phantom instrument almost, where you're like playing like a ghost instrument. Yeah.
And also like conceptually, and this also gets into a lot of people later down the road and why this instrument was so influential, is because unlike a lot of other instruments, basically like it threw out a lot of the traditional concept, like, conceptual frameworks around like an instrument at all. Instead of plucking a string or hitting a key, you moved your hand. And also, like, the level of kind of tones, like semitones, basically, between moving your hand up and down was much more subtle and rich than, like, playing on a piano. And that's what some of these avant-garde people came to resent around, like, keyboards and the piano, was that it locks you into, like, this pitch box, basically, where, there's stuff in between these notes, but, like, you can't really do it. But on the theremin, it's like, ooh, like you basically can do that. And also it's incredibly intuitive, right? Like obviously you could train and practice, like it takes some practice to become really, really good at it. But it's a kind of thing where you really can kind of walk up to it and start playing it intuitively with your hands right off the bat. And it doesn't take, a classical education and a bunch of lessons and stuff to get the fundamentals of. And that would become very attractive, like all around the world in kind of experimental music, like later in the 20th century, like trying to find some way to get out of that box of needing to be like a traditionally trained musician, like playing on strings or a keyboard, and approaching music creation and composing like more naturalistically, I guess. So I'm just going to jump in here to the Robert Moog interview with I think 95-year-old Leon Theremin in 1991, and we'll let Theremin tell his story a little bit. So they ask him, please tell us about your early life and about your scientific and musical training. Theremin says, I was born in Leningrad, which was then called St. Petersburg, in 1896. My father was a lawyer, and my mother was interested in the arts, especially music and drawing. Even before high school, I was interested in physics and electricity and in oscillatory motions, like those of a pendulum. In high school, I was interested in physics, and after playing the piano, I started studying cello. While in high school, I entered the conservatory on the cello, and I graduated with the title of Free Artist on the Violoncello. Then I entered the university, and I majored in physics and astronomy. and they asked, "When did you first conceive of your instrument?" And he says, "The idea first came to me right after our capital R revolution at the beginning of the Bolshevik state. I wanted to invent some kind of an instrument that would not operate mechanically, as does the piano or the cello and the violin, whose bow movements can be compared to those of a saw. I conceived of an instrument that would create sound without using any mechanical energy, like the conductor of an orchestra." They ask, "Why did you make this instrument?" He says, "I became interested in bringing about progress in music, so that there would be more musical resources. I was not satisfied with the mechanical instruments in existence, of which there were many. They were all built using elementary principles, and were not physically well done. I was interested in making a different kind of instrument, and I wanted, of course, to make an apparatus that would be controlled in space, exploiting electrical fields, and that would use little energy. Therefore, I used electronic technology to create a musical instrument that would provide greater resources." And then he asks, and I gotta say, I love this story. How did Lenin find out about your instrument? He says, "In the Soviet Union at that time, everyone was interested in new things, in particular all the new uses of electricity, for agriculture, for mechanical uses, for transport, and for communication. I decided to create a musical use for electricity. I made the first few devices based on principles of the human interference of radio waves in space, first for electronic security systems, then applied to musical purposes. There was a big electronics conference in Moscow, and I showed my instruments there. The conference was a great success. It was written up in the literature and the newspapers, of which we had many at the time, and many doors were open for me in the Soviet Union. And so, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the leader of our state, learned I had shown an interesting thing at this conference, and he wanted to get acquainted with it himself. They asked me to come with my apparatus, with my musical instrument, to his office to show him, and I did so. They asked, what did Lenin think of it? He was very gracious, and I was very pleased to meet him. I showed him and his colleagues the control system of my instrument, which I played by moving my hands in the air, and which at that time was called the Thereminvox. I played a piece of music, after which they applauded, including Vladimir Ilyich, who had been watching very attentively. I played Glinka's The Lark, which he loved very much. After all this applause, Vladimir Ilyich said that I should show him, and he would try to play it himself. He stood up, moved to the instrument, stretched his hands out, right hand to the pitch antenna and left to the volume antenna. I took his hands from behind and helped him. He started to play the Lark. He had a very good ear, and he felt where to move his hands to get the sound, to lower or raise the pitch. In the middle of this piece, I thought that he could, independently, move his hands. So I took my hands off his, and he completed the whole thing independently by himself, with great success and with great applause following. He was very happy that he could play on the instrument all by himself. So that's like kind of an amazing Lenin anecdote, is that like Lenin hears about basically, this is regarded as kind of one of the first technically electronic instruments in history that was played upon by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin himself and was approved of. I don't know. I just kind of love that anecdote. But you see there that the thing about Leon Theremin is that when it comes to the Soviet Union, he's a patriot, which I think a lot of people have a lot of these historians have a tough time with it, and they torture themselves into knots trying to come up with because they all respect him as an inventor, but they just hate that he basically was a loyal Soviet, though the story does get complicated, and it turns out I knew about that. I knew that he played the theremin for Lenin, and Lenin approved of it, but I had no idea what happened to theremin in the years after that, right?
Was this before or after he invented that sort of espionage device that didn't require any power?
We're gonna get to that.
Kind of passive.
We're gonna get to that. So that's what I'm referring to. So basically, he joins the Red Army technically during the Russian Civil War and is working in a laboratory in Moscow, and that's when he first invents the Thereminvox, or the theremin basically. And obviously, it's a huge hit, and many doors were opened for him. Lenin loved it, and throughout the 20s, he's doing his thing basically in the Soviet Union. And then in 1927, he moves to New York City. And he spends about a decade living in New York, from like the late 20s to the late 30s. So Robert Moog asks him, what brought you to New York? And Theremin says, when I was working in Leningrad at the Yoffe Institute for Physics and Technology, I had a lab. I was the inventor of this instrument, the first instrument. I was also the first in the world to invent a television device. This was in 1926. Now, that's true, too. He actually invented the first prototype of a television, essentially. Then, he says, I was sent abroad. I was sent to an international conference in Frankfurt. My wife Katya joined me in Paris, where I went next, and we stayed with my relatives. After that, we went to America. Katya was interested in medicine, and she wanted to enter a medical institute that was about 35 kilometers from New York. So she entered this medical school, and she slept there in the dormitory, but she visited me once or twice a week in New York. Now, this is kind of a wild story. I'll tell you what happened afterwards. One fine day, a young man came to me and said, "You know," he gave me his calling card, "I have a request to make of you and of your wife, too. We love each other. Let us marry each other." It was not quite pleasant for me, but I said, "Of course, I cannot forbid. Well, in the Soviet Union, we have freedom. Divorce is legal." But I told him that things could not happen in this way. He left, and I felt terrible. I tried to reach my wife, but the phones weren't working well. After a while, maybe 3 days later, I received from my embassy, because at the time I was working under the leadership of our consulate, a magazine that was published by German representatives of a fascist organization in America. In this article, it was written that, quote, "The wife of Theremin is sympathetic to our work, and we accepted her into our society. But Theremin doesn't want to pay money because he's probably a Jew, and he's afraid to give money. That's why he won't become a member of our society." Well, there was such a magazine. At the embassy, the people said, "We cannot allow this." Then, in a few days, they said something more definite. The embassy called me and demanded that I get a divorce from her. They gave us a divorce without her presence or consent. I talked to her on the telephone about it. She said, quote, "It's my friends, but I was never a member of any such society, and that was it. That was my first divorce." She continued to live there and to study at that institute. And he asks, "Are you Jewish?" And he says, "No." So what the fuck? His wife gets psyoped, gets honeypotted by a bunch of Nazi people in upstate New York, and then they try to do some kind of weird "Sir, give me your wife, I am in love with her." Very bizarre, right?
Yes. Wait, what was the "Sir, give me your wife" thing that happened?
Well, he says one day a young man came to me and said, "You know, I have a request to make of you and of your wife too. We love each other. Let us marry each other." And it sounds like he said, because he correctly points out in the Soviet Union they had freedom and divorce is legal, but it sounds in maybe his broken English that he said, "I can't forbid it," but also he sounds mad.
Right,
I told him that things could not happen in this way.
Right, so that was separate from the embassy demanding that he divorce her.
Well, no, it was connected to it. It was literally connected to it.
I guess it was beforehand. And then I guess somehow this person maybe published that knowing that this would be the consequence.
Yeah, then they went and published an angry Substack about how he's probably a Jew and he wasn't, I don't know but Theremin doesn't want to pay money. He's afraid to give money. I think they were implying that, the wife of Theremin is down, so maybe Theremin is recruitable. But when we went and talked to him, but it's weird that they went and talked to him and were like, "Dude, can I marry your wife?" That's not exactly a great pitch. I don't know. It's very bizarre, but I think it shows you that.
I'm curious to know more. It's very strange. Yeah, I don't know.
There is this book that I didn't get the time to read called Theremin, Ether Music, and Espionage.
Oh yeah, I looked at that. Yeah,
and that also has a very, even though it is written by somebody who knew Theremin and got to interview him a lot in Russia. It has a very anti-Soviet bias to the point where it's at the outset of the book, it's how do we square these two things and it kind of goes with the dominant thesis about him is that he was a Soviet Faust who sold his soul to the system in order to like go on inventing, basically. But that's one way of looking at it. Also note that, Theremin says when all this was going on, at the time he was working under the leadership of the Soviet consulate, which is still a murky thing to this day. But basically in New York, he was kind of living, he said he had a big house, he says, and he, I believe, ended up working technically for RCA, which started to market the Theremin as like a consumer product. He got a patent for it in the US, and he started, making money and working with RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, to kind of spread this thing. And he was a little bit of like a celebrity. Like they actually at
he
this
was a
point,
huge celebrity. He was like the Russian Edison.
celebrity.
Yeah,
He was like the Russian Edison. He hung out all the time with Albert Einstein a lot, and like I forget if he tried to teach him some instruments and stuff, but yeah, Einstein asked if he could use his home studio, so Einstein would come over all the time to try to teach himself the violin, and he was also messing around with the Thereminvox. He also notes that Albert Einstein was also very interested in the color of music, the connection between light and music, right? So even though I don't know enough about Albert Einstein, I don't think he was a theosophist, but in his own way, obviously, as a theoretical physicist, he was interested. Theremin actually says that, this is actually an interesting little passage. He says Einstein was interested in the connection between music and geometrical figures, not only color, but mostly triangles, hexagons, heptagons, different kinds of geometrical figures. He wanted to combine these into drawings. He asked whether he could have a laboratory in a small room in my house where he could draw, so I gave him a study, not very big. I found him an assistant, one of my coworkers who was a painter, to help him draft these sketches, and he would come and do his work. However, it was not the field that I was interested in, these geometrical figures. I can't say, from my point of view, the figures had a psychological effect on the colors of the music. As for him personally, Einstein was a physicist and theorist, but I was not a theorist. I was an inventor, so we did not have that much in common. I had much more kinship with someone like Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was interested in how the whole world is created.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, like, notice that, like, he's not bad-mouthing the Soviet Union. In fact, quite the opposite throughout this interview. Now, you could say it's because, like, they technically were still around and blah, blah, he was afraid to speak the truth. But
yeah, whether you want to or not, like, I mean, if he were to start like saying negative things about the Soviet Union, probably wouldn't have been like super great.
He actually does say that at the very end of the interview, like, don't misquote me as saying like that I liked working in other places better than the Soviet Union. Like ironically, like it might cause problem for me, haha. Like something like that.
Yeah.
But also he doesn't really give them anything to like go off of.
Right,
but
yeah.
But anyways, like
if he were to praise Einstein, although I don't necessarily doubt that maybe he was less like simpatico with Einstein, that would be like because he was like this. He was kind of like an American figure who would be competing with Theremin. So for Theremin to like praise him probably wouldn't have been good. Like although I guess Einstein was.
Einstein was kind of a socialist, though, to some extent. So he was at least a little more. He was more of a left wing kind of guy. So I could see that that him and Theremin would have they'd have that in common at least.
Музыкальный инструмент Thereminvox – это первый инструмент такого типа. Это песенно-голосовой инструмент. В нем управление мелодией достигается посредством влияния на электромагнитное поле около инструмента.
So Theremin in the United States, he starts working for the RCA, which is, powerhouse company back in those days. And I think some of it, I don't know if General David Sarnoff had yet risen to the top of RCA. He did serve in World War II. I feel like he might have actually... Oh, Sarnoff actually was Russian-born, interestingly. Instrumental in building and establishing the AM broadcasting radio business that became the standard of the 20th century. Oh, yeah, the weird synchronicity is that he was also involved in kind of fostering the development of television very early, like back in the 1920s, right around the same time. I think that that book about Theremin, I think it was that.
Ether and Espionage? Is that the same one?
Yeah, the Ether and Espionage.
Yeah.
I think it mentioned something like Theremin, developed television technology in like 1926, and meanwhile, David Sarnoff over at RCA was developing in the Soviet system. They immediately just took the technology and classified it and used it for CCTV surveillance. But in America, it became I Love Lucy. There isn't a more clear parallel between the ways that both countries would use their technologies. Shut the fuck up. Television played no role in the U.S. in advancing the ideological ends of capitalism.
Yeah, this is a pretty rough paragraph. Leon Theremin's story is something less than a metaphor for the divergence of communism and capitalism, totalitarianism and freedom, luxury and drudgery, hope and hopelessness. I mean, I feel like at other points in the book, it's a little bit less didactic than that, but in this case, it's that parallelism is really rough. I guess capitalism here is being put up against hopelessness, so I don't know, but yeah, it's kind of this setting up these binaries. But his life was a microcosm of these dueling scenarios, and he spent most of his nearly 100 years shuttling back and forth between them. A typical example that illustrates this chasm between Soviet and American culture. When Theremin built one of the first televisions in the 1920s, the Soviet government seized it, made it top secret, and pressed into service as a surveillance device for the border guards in the Kremlin. On the other end of the world, David Sarnoff, RCA's guiding star at the birth of television in America, later to be Theremin's employer, worked to put a set in every home and spoke glowingly of television's possibilities, to introduce Hamlet to the people and offer night school courses. Surveillance versus I Love Lucy. The divergence of Soviet and American culture can be almost unfathomable, and it would be laughable had it not been so tragic and typical.
It's
really funny to suggest that Americans had no interest in surveillance technologies. It's almost
first of all, and also, it's as if America didn't develop CCTV cameras and Russians didn't develop consumer television.
Exactly. Yeah. That's very obnoxious.
The technology was used by both sides for everything under the sun. If it's a metaphor for anything, maybe it's a metaphor for how the U.S. eventually won the Cold War. Was from the beginning they were more focused on mind war and basically using fun non-political things, these technologies of culture dissemination to program their audiences, to have a certain mentality, to mold them into the subjects that they needed them to
it
be.
Makes having a television, you were just mentioning George Orwell, in 1984, the television, I guess they are also partially for surveillance in that case, but, the point perhaps still stands that, a television in every home is, a dystopian thing, that it's obviously a technology of state control, which I feel like it certainly, many have observed that it is. It's not really a cutting edge point, but in this case, it's this amazing utopian thing that we all have TV and we can all watch I Love Lucy.
That actually cuts to the heart of, again, why, an interesting thing about the way people perceive, Orwell, the fucking snitch, as, this guy, as something other than, an anti-Soviet propagandist, which is really what that book is, because even though there's a TV and everything, the real evil thing is, one, that it's watching you, and two, that it's pumping out fake ingsoc propaganda that is like stupid and wrong and like flies in the face of all truth and stuff. But it's like if, Winston Smith was hanging out and there's a TV in every room playing I Love Lucy all the time, then like it wouldn't be a dystopia. It's almost implied by that like, well, on our televisions that are in every living room, we have like fun, happy things on TV, not some like scary propaganda thing. But it's like, my brother in Christ, like, this is propaganda in a certain way. Also, literally, imagine in a communist country if like every 4 minutes on a show, you had to watch like 4 minutes of like just like straight up propaganda about like the Communist Party and like how epic they are. Like, I'm sure maybe they had some version of that, but I'm just talking about a parallel to corporate advertising and the advertising of commodities and services.
Yeah, I
right?
mean, they definitely did have stuff like that, but yeah. Like,
but I mean, I think even that, I think it wasn't as interrupting and like in your face as like commodity advertising was on American television and radio from the very beginning, which is like, that's why they're called soap operas, because the soap companies were bankrolling them. Like there always was that subliminal kind of aspect of radio and television that it's really something that he doesn't, that author does not bring it up at all, that it's slipping in subliminally. Like it's just part of the ecosystem of getting to listen to a radio play or watching a variety show is you just have to put up with these ads that take up like a third of the entire running time, right? And that persisted well into like our young adulthood as like the only real until like TiVo came around. There was really no model to circumvent that. So for, almost a good like 80 years, we got absolutely saturated with these like flashy commercials for commodities or banks or other Ford trucks, you name it, that in their own way were like a kind of meta propaganda, right? Like, I mean, there's a psyop level of like wanting to get you to buy the product, but also it like centralizes like the capitalist economy at the heart of like this supposedly enlightening entertainment medium that is totally gonna, bring Shakespeare to the masses and stuff like that. But you have to, in order for, it to be disseminated to the masses, it has to come with just like spamming you, kind of the way the internet does today with advertising. Like relatively speaking, like spamming you with like ad content all the time. And that was like, those are the people bankrolling the whole shebang, really. But okay, getting back to music though. So he was working for RCA. He was living it up in New York City. Let me go back to his interview here. He gets divorced because I guess his wife gets seduced by Nazis. It's still not. Maybe the book at least gets into more factual information about that kind of stuff. But in this interview, he talks about some of the like influential composers that came to him, including Edgar Varese, right, who would go on to be a kind of musique concrète big shot, and also a huge childhood influence on a young Frank Zappa. Actually,
right.
I know from watching a BBC documentary, he was going on and on about getting like Edgar Varese records and playing them over and over again, which like really he did get involved in some experimental like electronic stuff, but really worked with a lot of like dissonance and like natural sounds and things like that. So he talks about like he made an electronic cello for Varese and other people who were interested. And there are a few spin-off instruments, and Stokowski was another one. Let's see, just going a little more deeper into the 30s. Yeah, Clara Rockmore was like one of these virtuosic theremin players who would play like entire concert halls. And by this point, by like the early 30s, Theremin had designed one that could be amplified so loud that it could play with like an orchestra and fill up like an entire concert hall, essentially. So Clara Rockmore became like this kind of virtuoso performer. And he also, he invented something called the Rhythmicon, which was actually, it sounds like a kind of early like sequencer, like a rhythmic sequencer for, basically a tone or something like that. He says that this was an instrument that produced one pitch plus all of its harmonics. Each of the harmonics was heard as a series of repeating notes separated by silences. For each harmonic, the repetition speed was related to the number of the harmonic. For instance, when you have the pitch 3 times higher, It will repeat 3 times as fast as the fundamental pitch and stuff. He also had one that was kind of controlled by dancing, where like the movement of the dancer can make it the sound get louder. I think this was called the terpsitone, and had a lot of dancers at a studio where he was like, I don't know, training people to dance with this kind of thing. They ask him, do you have anything more to add about your life in New York? He mentions this. There are many interesting things connected with my work, with the composers I had to see. But anyway, I felt lonely. I sometimes called my wife on the telephone, but I couldn't get her attention. Well, we really didn't argue, but I felt lonely that I had no wife. I had my studio where I was conducting many studies on the terpsitone. I had a very beautiful student, a black woman. She danced well, and it happened that we liked each other very much. When I said in my consulate that I liked a black woman, they said, okay, marry her. Based Soviets. Then we went to the consulate where we were married, and that was my marriage number 2. Her name was Lavinia Williams. When I left America, I had to leave America. She was to be sent in a few weeks. So just side note there that Lavinia Williams was like a famous African-American dancer who was based in New York City at the time, and he married her, which I read in other sources caused a huge stir in like the social scenes of like Americans that he was hanging out with. Like a lot of people did not approve of this, but you know who did approve? The Soviet consulate, because they were not racist back then, despite what probably the author of this book probably will try to claim elsewhere. But okay, so he was married to Lavinia Williams, but then they say, why did you leave New York? And this is where the story starts to get very interesting with him. Theremin says, I left New York because at that time the war was coming. The military troops of the fascists were approaching Leningrad, and so on. I asked to be sent to the Soviet Union so as to make myself useful. I asked many times. For a whole year I asked to be sent back. The war had already started, and they didn't send me. Then at last they permitted me. They assigned me to be an assistant to the captain of a large motor ship. So I went home, but they did not take my wife. And then they say, so what happened then? He says, I was arrested, and I was taken prisoner. Not quite a prisoner, but they put me in a special lab in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. There I worked in this lab, just as others worked. Airplane designer Andrei Tupolev was imprisoned in such a way too, if you know about that. He was considered to be a prisoner, and I was considered a prisoner too. So what did you do in that lab, they ask. He says, electronics and other things that were mostly associated with military matters, television and other types of communication. And they say, weren't you in a camp? And he says, at one time, on the way to the laboratory, I was sent to a camp where they did road construction. I was assigned to be supervisor over the prisoners. From there, after 8 months on road construction, I was sent with Tupolev to the Aviation Institute. Many important people worked there. Missile designer Sergei Korolev worked there for me. I think that was like the godfather of the Soviet space program. They asked him, why were you arrested? He says, we were all under suspicion, all the people. And I, as a suspicious person, was assigned to be under investigation. He was declared sus. The investigator was occupied with my case for a month or more. He and the magistrate asked me all kinds of questions. This was all very formal, and they congratulated me and said that everything was okay, but they said unfortunately there would be a second investigation. There is a second investigator who also asked questions, and they wrote down that everything would be fine. But after that, together with the other prisoners, I went with Tupolev. Officially, I was considered a prisoner, but as soon as I arrived, they made me the supervisor of a group of prisoners. And then they asked, why was your name not mentioned in the West? We have one book that says you died around 1945. This is a book from, I guess, 81 said that. And he says, because at that time my arrival was kind of secret, at the end of a long situation, a long time passed, about half a year, and then there was a procedure that was standard with many people who were under suspicion. At that time it was quite acceptable for people to be detained in such a way. I was appointed to be in charge of the laboratory, but it was written that they could detain me as a prisoner. They used a word not as terrible as, quote, prison, but I was in prison there for 8 years. And then they ask, what did you do after you became free? And he says, I stayed in my lab. First I was under some supervision. Then I became the director of the lab. I remained in the same place. I had some new things that I invented. I received a big bonus. I received an apartment. It was at that time I got remarried to Maria. 8 years elapsed while I was there. Even when I was interned, I was treated very well. I was not considered to be in prison, but I worked as a normal person. I was the head of the lab, and when they liberated me, I was still working in the same lab. It turned out that when I was free, it was much more difficult to work in the lab. When I was considered to be imprisoned, I had a supervisor, and they would say to me that I had to do this and that. Then when I was freed, I had to do it myself. Then I had to fuss, do much more paperwork, keep an office in order. The work became much worse. So it's I liked being in the gulag.
I was in the gulag. Yeah.
I wish I was in the gulag. Oh my God. Yeah. Then he goes on to talk about the late 60s when he finally semi-retired and in 66 and then took a job at the Moscow Conservatory. But then something interesting happens where he started working on electronic musical instruments and dancing instruments and stuff, like picking back up on that stuff. And he says, there was a very unpleasant situation at the conservatory that I'm going to tell you about. One of the journalists from the New York Times came to Svishnikov, the director, and said, "We thought Theremin was dead, but it turns out that he's working here. I would like to meet him and see him to find out what he's been doing." Svishnikov called me to his office, and I talked to the journalist. I showed the man the musical instrument, a good Thereminvox I'd made, and the dancing instrument. He liked them very much. And then it happened that in a month, the newspaper arrived containing an article that Theremin is doing this and that, electrical musical instruments in the conservatory, instruments for dancing. This is Music, Leon Theremin by Harold C. Schoenberg, New York Times, April 1967. This very newspaper got in the hands of Svishnikov's assistant. His name was Nuzhin, and he did not know what I was doing there. This is how he learned that electrical musical instruments were being made in the conservatory. He announced that, quote, "Electricity is not good for music. Electricity is to be used for electrocution." So he ordered that all these instruments be removed from the conservatory, and Theremin too, and to throw all these things out, and that there be no more projects at the conservatory. And then he had to move to the Department of Acoustics at Moscow University and continue kind of more engineering related work, but he wasn't allowed to directly work on music after that, at the conservatory, because it was considered, I don't know what's going on there in the late 60s with in the Brezhnev era. Maybe they did fall off a little bit, because it seems kind of, before we go any further here, I think we have to wind back to his mysterious disappearance from New York City. I think he says it was after the war started, but I thought it had been in 1938 or 39, right around the time of the trials and the purges and things like that. But maybe this happened in 1940 or even 41, because he says that the fascists were descending upon Leningrad. So it might have been in 1941, but before America was in the war. But either way, this happens. Leon Theremin, from the American perspective, Leon Theremin just vanishes one day, and nobody knows where he went. The only account of it is that a couple Russian guys from the consulate came by and told him to pack his things, and then he left with them and was gone. And there were all kinds of rumors during World War II about what maybe had happened, because people heard that he was arrested and sent to a gulag, and then there were even widespread rumors that he had been shot for anti-Soviet activities upon returning, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I'm reading about, because, I was pretty intrigued by that story about, his wife and having to divorce her. So I'm trying to see what this book, Theremin, about ether, music, and espionage by Glinsky, has to say about Katya. It doesn't seem to mention anything about, the accusations of her being fascist, but it does, or being, associated with fascists, but it does have this, this is, they're talking about much later. This is kind of wrapping up our story at the end of the book, but it does say, back when Lev Sergeyevich embarked on his, that is Theremin, embarked on his European odyssey in 1927, his brother-in-law, Alexander Konstantinov, had stepped in to replace him at the Physico-Technical Institute as head of the Laboratory of Electroacoustic Radio Measurements and Television. In the early 30s, Alexander had distinguished himself as a television pioneer with a patent on an electronic camera tube similar to the iconoscope Zworykin had developed in America. This led to his appointment as a chief scientist at the first television center in Leningrad. But only months later, in the pre-dawn hours of November 1st, 1936, he was arrested at his home in a roundup that snared many of the top minds in physics, geology, and astronomy. In America, Katya learned of her brother's arrest and predicted they will kill him. For 7 months, Konstantinov and his colleagues endured the customary rituals of incessant interrogation and quote-unquote investigation. On May 25, 1937, the military collegium, a 3-person high tribunal, in a closed trial with no evidence, accused him of membership in a counter-revolutionary fascist organization and of conspiring to construct a bomb using a seismographic device to kill Stalin at a presidium meeting. He was sentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence, which in reality meant immediate execution following the trial. He was shot the next day. After his liquidation, his wife was sent to Kolyma on an 8-year sentence, still unaware of her husband's fate. And 2 of their underage daughters, together with their grandmother, were permanently exiled from Leningrad. Konstantinov's family was informed of his death only in 1956 when he was posthumously rehabilitated under Khrushchev. But the date was revised to December 1945, and the cause attributed to heart failure. Katya would never know the truth about her brother. In 1988, a year after her death, the family finally learned of his execution, though his burial place remained unknown to them. According to her wishes, Katya was cremated and her ashes were strewn over the Atlantic Ocean in the direction of Russia, so she could be closer to home. She never knew that her brother's arrest warrant charged that he had relatives abroad who did not return, and he is in correspondence with them. I wonder if, related to the story, I wonder if it was that because his brother-in-law was under suspicion by them, they needed to separate him from his wife,
Interesting. I think the wife thing happened very early, much earlier than him going back to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this was like when he was already on his European. This was like in 1936-ish.
Okay, so it still would have been a couple years before he went back.
Yeah. But he still got a divorce from her around that time.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
he did. But there could be something
and everything. The brother-in-law was still there. So they might have
his brother-in-law in the U.S.
In the Soviet Union.
Okay, he was in the Soviet Union.
The guy who ended up getting sent to the quote-unquote sent to the gulag, but actually killed.
That's interesting that didn't even come up. It certainly didn't come up in the interview. Maybe that's natural.
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's possible that he didn't even know about it because the family didn't even know about it until 1956, depending on when the interview was.
Yeah,
and he might not have heard what the family learned because he had stopped caring about Katya by that, if it were later. I don't know. But
was this his brother-in-law through Katya?
Yeah, as her brother.
So okay. So yeah, he did marry, I think he might have married into a Russian family that was a little fashy and
It's possible. I mean, maybe they had reason to be suspicious of him, but either way,
I think
it
also
totally makes sense that they would want to dissociate those two families. Either if they're suspicious, if Khrushchev was right, even though, he's been known to lie, according to Grover Furr, about rehabilitating him later on, or not, it kind of makes sense in terms of why they would be sort of pushing for this divorce to happen.
Definitely. I mean, that sounds like a huge security risk. And also, I think he says at the beginning of this book, Ether Music and Espionage, that at one point during an interview, Theremin mentioned to him that, I was something of a rezident in New York, which, means not that he was living there, but the residentura was basically the main, it's kind of like the CIA station chief of a consulate or an embassy or something, like the residentura. So residents were high-ranking Soviet intelligence officers. Yeah. So he's saying, and he was almost like a little merry prankster in his own way, because you can't tell if he's just kind of cracking a joke or exaggerating. Apparently he was prone to exaggerating certain things and also telling different versions of the same story.
Yeah, it seems
from his life, and there was definitely a little bit of a fog going on around Theremin. And the other thing though is that part of that might have been intentional, because he says earlier in this book, I just noticed when he arrives, just to tell you what kind of milieus he was running around in when he was in the U.S. he writes that, Russian inventor arrives with magic musical wand. A musical device which may eliminate radio, phonographs, and all other musical instruments was demonstrated this week by Leon Theremin, a newspaper said. Several days later, the inventor left for Washington, D.C., where his instruments and 13 boxes of tools had been sent on. At the Hotel Washington, he set up a temporary lab and residence to conduct research and prepare for his New York debut in January. In the capital, there was no Soviet embassy. That's important to keep in mind. Nor was there a consulate in New York. Russia had no formal diplomatic relations with the U.S. at that time, and the situation was unlikely to improve in the near future. But the Soviets had gained a foothold on American soil anyway, by beating the capitalists at their own game. The U.S., though wary of conceding political recognition to the Kremlin, saw every advantage in a business relationship based on the conviction that a vast untapped market for American goods existed in Russia. Now, here's a name we've tapped on before. In 1921, the U.S. businessman Armand Hammer set events in motion when he formed the Allied American Corporation, Almerico, the first American entity to do business with the USSR. By 1924, he was representing Russian commercial interests for 37 major U.S. companies. In May 1924, Almerico merged with two small Soviet firms in New York to form the AMTORG Trading Corporation, the first Soviet-run trading organization in the U.S., modeled after Arcos and Wostwag. While it conducted millions of dollars of legitimate business in the U.S., AMTORG was, in reality, the command center for all Soviet intelligence activities in America. Wow. Located in New York as a check-in point and routing station for Russian agents, it took the place of an embassy or diplomatic legation, but it was better. Its commercial infrastructure disguised its motives. It provided its own funding channels. Any exposed acts of espionage would pale in the light of the immense profits generated for American business, and under the pretext of testing potential U.S. exports to the Soviet Union, it could gain unlimited access to American manufacturing plants for industrial espionage. Beyond that, it provided a cover for a vast, always changing pool of employees, many of them agents on temporary missions in the U.S. AMTORG harbored three spheres of activity. The Comintern, in league with the CPUSA, the American Communist Party, masterminded propaganda and revolutionary agitation. Okay, sorry, this guy is, just try to read past the bias. In league with the CPUSA, masterminded propaganda and revolutionary agitation, channeling funds into local communist-run unions and organizations such as the Daily Worker and the Daily Freiheit. The OGPU kept a check on counterintelligence and party loyalty within the network of operatives, and the GRU supervised the siphoning of data on U.S. military technology and American industry. Theremin's, quote, little extra assignment, of course, came under this banner. So I guess he mentioned having a little extra assignment when he went to New York? I didn't read earlier, so I don't know for sure, but...
Yeah. It seemed like he definitely was, pretty involved person and all of that. Yeah, and his exit was also kind of shady and had to do with the CPUSA, according to this author. That they
okay.
Yeah.
Hold on. I just want to mention his first performance of January 24th, 1928. The syndicated columnist Lemuel F. Parton announced an invisible plectrum sounding the music of the, quote, spheres will come true in New York next Tuesday evening with the first American demonstration of the, quote, ethereal music of Professor Leon Theremin. On January 24th, 1928. Now, this is wild because we're about to get a hit of names that we just talked about, or a few episodes just talked about. A parade of illustrious New York gentry, glitterati, and cultural luminaries streaming out of taxis and limousines climbed the steps of the Hotel Plaza and headed toward the Grand Ballroom for an 8:30 p.m. demonstration. Rudolf Wurlitzer had mobilized the group, under whose auspices Theremin would make his private U.S. debut. Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Astor, Mr. Astor was there. Mr. and Mrs. Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son. Mr. and Mrs. Charles S. Guggenheimer. I don't know. That might be a typo. I think he means Guggenheim, right?
I don't know. I really don't know.
So far, all Titanic victims. Mr. and Mrs. Fritz Chrysler, Mr. and Mrs. Herbert N. Strauss. I wonder if that's Isidore Strauss. Mr. Walter Damrosch, Mr. Felix Warburg of the Warburg banking dynasty, and a host of others. As the 500 invited guests took their seats in the ballroom, many well-known faces were among them. Arturo Toscanini, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Joseph Szigeti, Cleveland Orchestra conductor Nikolai Sokolov, and Metropolitan Opera soprano Elizabeth Rethberg. So then, he comes out there and I think, blows these people away pretty much. I'd like to know how he does it, a woman in silver lame whispered to her escort. I don't know, he replied, but he's better than Thurston, referring to the contemporary magician. Theremin placed a bowl of colorless liquid before the audience and caused it to pass through the colors of the spectrum by infusing it with varying electric waves. Then he positioned the Illumovox to play a spotlight across his face, training over his cheeks the melding rays of wine red and successively blue, yellow, and emerald green. When he switched the electric current and tossed an echo to the back of the room, the New York Evening Post reviewer noticed. People turned their heads incredulously, and Rosamond Pinchot, who had been leaning ecstatically on a balcony rail, hastily put on a pair of tortoiseshell glasses. Theremin startled the audience when he played on his, quote, invisible orchestra music stand model.
Yeah,
Wow.
There actually was a Guggenheimer, Charles S. Guggenheimer. It was not a
I
Guggenheim.
thought there might be. Okay.
Yeah, it's a Guggenheimer.
But also everybody else,
prominent person.
a Strauss and Astor.
Yeah.
A lot of Titanic victim families in the Fords, of course.
Yeah, this is, kind of describing his activities in New York at the time, and also it has some CP USA stuff from the same book. There's some interesting stuff here, that talks about later on. This is from 1930s. It kind of jumps around a little bit in talking about the Depression and everything. But unlike his compatriot Schillinger, who openly eschewed communist dogmatism and all it stood for, wearing his newfound U.S. citizenship like an honored uniform, Theremin had a soul that was Russian to the core. His long U.S. residence was by no means signaled an embrace of the capitalist free enterprise system, a weakness for the whimsy and free-spiritedness of American culture, or a desire to break with Soviet life and ideology. After America's open arms stopped short of an embrace and the inventor receded into virtual anonymity, the country simply remained, for a while, a convenient testing ground for his ideas, encouraged especially by the GRU. Of course, I was there on assignment all the time, he later admitted, but the assignments dealt with seemingly unimportant issues for military purposes. As one possibility after another presented itself, the scientist, whose ultimate passion was to be constantly inventing, saw nothing objectionable in forging deeper relationships with American industry and using his technology to develop his work and his knowledge for the betterment of his homeland. Each 6-month visa extension was merely another bookmark to hold a place as he worked his way through the chapters of American commerce. His extended stay was destined to come to an end. Forfeiting his Russian citizenship would have been unthinkable. It was never an option. Despite his stunts for the paparazzi after his arrival, his willingness to go along with the public appearances and promotional razzmatazz expected of him, Theremin was never truly assimilated into mainstream American life. His demeanor was colored by an aristocratic distance and decorum left over from his imperial Russian heritage. There was a seriousness in him that precluded any casual American backslapping. He surrounded himself with members of the Russian community: Clara Rockmore, Schillinger, Morris Hillquit, the Bolantines, Zinaide Hannenfeld, Alexandra Stepanov, and others. And he spoke Russian whenever he could, even with Lavinia. Anne Stern remembered that he never learned English properly, and Rosalind Turek recalled that in 1932, during her lessons, he used a limited vocabulary repeatedly punctuated with his favorite word, approximately. Yolanda Bolantine remembered him with great fondness as a kindly, avuncular figure with a courtly manner, recalling the time he presented her family with a radio he had made them. I think he missed having Russians around him, she remembered. He missed home. He was homesick. It goes on a little bit to talk about this. Theremin's broad view of American society was tinged with a certain disdain. In 1928, after his Symphony Hall demonstration in Boston, he told a reporter for the Harvard Crimson, "Americans do not seem to see any interest in the problems of invention in music. Every people has its own ideas of art determined by the inherent temperament of the race. The European temperament is enormously different in character from that found in America." Certainly, the U.S. economic climate during the Depression decade did not speak well for the integrity of capitalism. The bank failures and breadlines Theremin witnessed, in contrast to the wealth of the Rosens, the Rockefellers, and others, gave him all the stronger reason to support a Marxist stance. One after another, his companies had fallen victim to economic famine, and his own debts had left him in financial ruin. In September 1931, he witnessed something about these synthesizer entrepreneurs, they invent all these things, but they can't hack it in business. In September 1931, he witnessed Morris Hillquit's reaction to a wage reduction by big corporations and a continued fall in consumer prices. The capitalistic system has broken down, quoted the New York Times, and the two major political parties are unable to restore economic stability. Morris Hillquit, national chairman of the Socialist Party, declared in a statement today. He advised the American voter to turn to the Socialist Party as the only hope of working out an intelligent program of social reconstruction. Private capitalism is breaking down all over the world. It has piled up vast wealth for the few and thrown millions of toilers into the breadlines. Only socialism can cure the devastating ills which capitalism has created. The personnel of our government and lawmaking bodies, including Congress, must be replaced by faithful and intelligent representatives of the working masses. As hard evidence of Hillquit's ideas, Theremin saw U.S. citizens flocking by the thousands to the Soviet Union to find work. In August of 1931, the AMTORG Trading Corporation announced it had received over 100,000 applications from skilled American workers to fill openings for 6,000 jobs in cities throughout Russia. Stalin's 5-year plan had created a new job market due to the shortage of Russian skilled labor, and positions for miners, railroad workers, bricklayers, carpenters, and workers in other trades were available. Although AMTORG announced it had capped the limit at 6,000, applicants continued to storm its offices, and by October, 500 to 600 a day were reportedly being turned away. The majority of those hired paid their own passage to Russia and brought their families with them with the intention of settling permanently in the Soviet Union. In all cases, the New York Times reported, the American immigrant will receive the same rights and privileges enjoyed by the native worker, such as social insurance, recreation, and the education of his children. The 6,000 sent to Russia supplemented the 2,500 skilled American workers and more than 1,000 U.S. engineers already employed there. After 1935, Theremin would even see the American Communist Party begin to insinuate itself into the liberal mainstream. As a result of the Popular Front, an alliance of the CPUSA with liberals and socialists designed to unite against fascism, communists could be found in every sector of American life. The newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations had 1/4 of its membership in communist-run unions by the late 30s. The American Youth Congress, an organization of the largest youth groups in America, was led by communists. The Minnesota Farmer Labor Party, the American Labor Party, and dozens of other groups were communist-dominated. In the early years of the Depression, the CPUSA was the first to lead nationwide demonstrations and violent strikes, protesting rising unemployment. The movement crossed racial boundaries as well, adopting an early civil rights platform for blacks. In 1930, the Comintern issued resolutions stating that communists openly and unreservedly fight for the rights of Negroes, for national self-determination in the South, and advocated confiscation of the landed property of the white landowners and capitalists for the benefit of the Negro farmers. Beginning in 1931, the Communist Party conducted a series of trials in Harlem in a workers' court to prosecute members accused of white chauvinism, expelling from the party those found guilty, and in one case, touching off the deportation of a convicted comrade to Finland. It's Tom's ancestor. In 1938, the party announced the blacks made up 9.2% of its national membership and 6% in New York, where major black entertainers regularly performed at party functions. When 9 black youths were arrested in Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931 and charged with raping 2 white women, the party rallied to defend the young men, attracting international attention to the case with the support of such prominent intellectuals as Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, and Theodore Dreiser. Through causes like this, the party won many converts among Americans committed to social justice. One particularly large segment identified with a leftist posture in the 1930s America was the community of artists, writers, and intellectuals. As the CPUSA sought new allies in the struggle against the growing threat of fascism, it was forced to mine the ranks of bourgeois culture, once seen as the antithesis of the proletarian movement. Leftist theater groups were particularly active, and by 1934, the League of Workers Theater boasted over 300 affiliated workers' theaters set up to spread the message of the class struggle. Organizations like the Workers' Laboratory Theater that presented mobile agitprop plays in New York subways. Writers were attracted to the John Reed clubs emerging around the country and associated themselves with the communist-dominated League of American Writers and American League Against War and Fascism. The CPUSA raised substantial funds in Hollywood, and musicians such as Aaron Copland were recruited for the Pierre de Gaiter clubs, named after the composer of the Internationale. Because Theremin fraternized within artistic spheres, he invariably found himself in companies sympathetic to his Soviet ideology. Leopold Stokowski, in defiance of the Philadelphia Board of the American Legion, directed the singing of the Internationale at one of his young people's concerts in 1934, and according to the Daily Worker, the conductor declared the audience itself at a previous concert had asked that the Internationale be played so that they could join in singing. The same year, Stokowski spoke at a Lenin Memorial meeting in Philadelphia on his composition Ode to Lenin, performed for the occasion by the Pierre de Gaiter String Quartet. In 1929, the conductor had presented the world premiere of Alexander Klein's Ode of the Morning to the Memory of Lenin. In 1934, he introduced Harold MacDonald's Festival of the Worker. So, yeah, I mean,
that's all very important to keep in mind, like the 1930s.
It seems like it makes sense why, like, J. Edgar Hoover had, like, red flagged Theremin. Yeah.
Absolutely.
An inspector from the Baltimore office of the Bureau of Immigration had called and advised the Labor Department had been interested for some time in causing the return to Russia of one Professor Leon Theremin, who had overstayed a temporary residence in the United States. He stated the Labor Department had attempted to cause Theremin's return to Russia and was advised by Theremin's attorney, Mayor Bloomfield, that Theremin was conducting confidential experiments in the United States on behalf of the Division of Investigation, Department of Justice, and on behalf of the War Department. Theremin's experiments were supposed to be in the magnetic ray field.
And you know what? Like, they might not have been totally off base, because when I'm looking at, like, all of his activities and movements and all the other things, like this groundswell of support in the 1930s during the Great Depression for, communism and socialism, like, I definitely am not ruling out that he was a bit of a rezident, right? Like, on a little extra mission to infiltrate, like, the commanding heights of, like, American high society and American business. And and the academy and everything else, and like celebrities, and like, because think about it, I mean, this guy,
the FBI certainly was afraid, and they did not find any evidence that he, was working for the U.S. War Department. Only, but they certainly had the sense that he was working for the Soviet Union, and that's definitely the thesis of this author. Which, I mean, that would make sense given like the later stuff that he did, in terms of his inventions. Yeah.
There's one other thing here in the book that I just noticed that again just underscores like his sort of a potential infiltration all the way up to the top. And it was talking, I think this is actually in the late 20s, like maybe right before the stock market crash. But it says, in April, at the time Theremin was preparing his pupils, because he was teaching people, for their Carnegie Hall debut, one member of the group, the society woman Lucy Bigelow Rosen, and her husband, the trial lawyer and international banker Walter Tower Rosen, poked around Theremin's lab to indulge their curiosity and discovered the extent of his unconventional research. Quote, We visited his first little rooms here, Lucy wrote in a letter to John D. Rockefeller Jr., and found them overflowing with coils and lamps and mirrors. We saw a vast television machine for a screen 20 times larger than any that is yet deemed practicable, and a microphone without wires. An oscillograph made our voices visible, and another instrument measured the beats of sound. By the time Lucy Rosen joined the Hotel Plaza coterie of students in 1930, Theremin was already on a financial downturn, and the tour of the lab was an eye-opener. Quote, a great many things could not be shown because there was not space, or finished because he had not money, but we did not know that for some time. He had had flattering recognition in Berlin and Paris and London, and received large sums as a new wonder on his arrival in America, which supported his little laboratory and costly independent experiments for a time. But many interesting things are not immediately profitable, and the Depression came when no commercial interests felt speculative. We saw him giving up one thing after another without explanation, and felt this was a waste, if we ever saw a waste, of creative imagination and tireless energy. The Rosens owned 5 townhouses in Manhattan, 3 on West 54th Street and 2 around the corner on West 55th. Lucy's growing devotion to the instrument and her earnestness in wanting to see the inventor carry out his research led the couple to offer Theremin the use of their 4-story brownstone at 37 West 54th Street, next door to their own residence at 35 West. Having the professor in close proximity meant Lucy could pop in and out for regular tips on space control technique, and she could peer over his shoulder at brash new technologies in their infancy. For Theremin, it meant a residence and laboratory at a modest rent, ample room to carry out unlimited research, in what Lucy called, quote, good old-fashioned spaces, and a setting where he could open an informal school to train performers on his instruments. Given his financial peril, the offer was too good to pass up. In December 1930, more than $12,000 in debt, and with his corporate dreams in pieces, the inventor transferred his Theremin studio to 37 West 54th Street. So he ends up getting kind of surviving off the largesse to some extent of this woman, Lucy Rosen, and he writes a little more about her in the next chapter. Lucy Rosen is one of the most original women in New York's social world, the New York Evening Journal observed. She has very curly blonde hair, which fuzzes out into a wide halo around her delicate and ethereal face, and Mrs. Rosen's sartorial effects are always extremely picturesque. Her robe de style evening gowns are said to be designed by Mr. Rosen. In stark black or her sweeping white toga mantle, Lucy was a statuesque enchantress at her RCA instrument. In the person of Lucy Bigelow Rosen, Theremin could not have positioned himself more strategically in the echelons of New York society in the 30s. Whoa. Born, are you ready for this? Mm-hmm. Born Lucy Bigelow Dodge in 1890. Dodge alert. Mm-hmm. That's ironic because we're talking about the Phelps Dodge Company, the Bisbee deportation, like real silk topper, anti-union, Dodge, also automobiles, right? So she's a Dodge. And I don't know exactly where the Bigelows come from, but they do pop up a lot. I think the Bigelows are another New England family. So Lucy Bigelow Dodge is clouded up. She's a fire wasp, right? She was the scion of some of Gotham's foremost scholars, statesmen, and members of the Social Register. Oh, here we go. Her maternal grandfather, John Bigelow, was U.S. ambassador to France under Abraham Lincoln, first president of the New York Public Library, and editor of the New York Evening Post with William Cullen Bryant. Her mother, after a brief marriage to Charles Stewart Dodge, married Lionel Guest, the youngest son of Lord Windburn of the famous Guest family. In 1914, Lucy married Walter Tower Rosen, a Harvard-educated trial lawyer and international investment banker, the son of a Jewish family in Berlin. The couple had 2 children, Walter Bigelow Rosen, born 1915, and Anne Bigelow Rosen, born 1917. From 1930 to 39, the Rosens built Carrymore, a sprawling 100-acre estate in the hills of northern Westchester, New York. At the heart of the wooded expanse, they erected a vast Mediterranean-style villa with red-tiled roofs and a central Spanish courtyard cloister. Wow, they have tons of art. They have the gold. They own the gold-burnished bed of Pope Urban VIII. So, these are elites, basically, to the highest level. And basically, this daughter, the scion, becomes obsessed with Theremin. And basically becomes his patron of the Theremin studio. So he's really up in there. seems like there's a lot of intrigue there. Kind of wish I'd read this entire book, but there might be like some more tea in there. But what becomes clear, and I don't know, it's the vibe I get from the interview with him in 1991 is like he keeps emphasizing, again, maybe he's like minimizing this for various reasons, but he's like emphasizing that, like, yeah, I was in prison, because everyone heard that he was like thrown in gulag or like shot. So they're imagining like he's like breaking rocks for 12 hours a day. But he's like, no, like he was in the science gulag, you know, with these famous rocket scientists and aviation guys. And he's doing very top secret work. So I almost wonder, it sounds like he was genuinely investigated, and he was put in kind of a category of like, to be on the safe side, you were going to be sequestered for basically like the duration of World War II. But yeah, he doesn't strike me as like a traitor or somebody who actually was doing something sus, like from an anti-Soviet perspective. And on top of that, he seems to have been maybe to some degree an intelligence operative. I think it's earlier in this book where this author expresses some, I think maybe in the introduction, where he expresses some kind of shock that these cynical Soviets were, you know, using like normal citizens to do espionage when they go abroad. And the idea that everybody had to, like, whether you were like a ballerina or an artist or, you know, like all kinds of people, not just government officials or a scientist, like you would be expected upon returning to like check in with the KGB and be like, all right, like who do you meet with? Like who do you talk to? Just kind of like, you know, like pass on information. And I don't know, I think it was this author, Albert Glinsky, that was like, wow, like, you know, I've talked to American, like elite American businessmen and scientists, and like I asked them if like they ever got, you know, contacted by the FBI or the CIA after going to the Soviet Union, and all of them are like, nope, like, which, you know, he takes at face value. But it's kind of like, okay, like it does make sense that they would be using people in these capacities. And also, like, every side does that. Like, the idea that the West didn't use, like, high society people as intelligence operatives or businessmen or whatever, like, is ridiculous. Like, we absolutely were doing the same thing. So I don't think it's, I think we can, like, dispel that it was, like, this uniquely sneaky Soviet thing that they would do, where like every social interaction they had abroad was like a means to an end. But I think in Theremin's case, to some extent that might be true. Like, yeah, he spends a decade there.
Yeah, I found this quote here. It's from a violinist, Leonid Kogan, right? And he says, I was aware that many people did not like him. Once there was even a protest demonstration against him because of rumors that he was involved with the KGB. I don't quite understand why Kogan was singled out. Oh, sorry, this is about him. This is Nathan Milstein talking about Leonid Kogan. So I've read the memoirs of Soviet intelligence officer Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who wrote that all members of the Soviet delegations to the West, whether scientists, musicians, or ballerinas, are obligated to report to the government on everything they see and hear. For instance, they're asked, well, you met with Rothschild, what did he say, what does he think, and so on. Leonid Kogan was not an exception in that regard. I always wondered why the Soviets make their artists report in their contacts with the West. I mean, what useful information could Kogan bring back? I once asked that marvelous violinist and dear man Isaac Stern whether the FBI or CIA invited him for a chat after his trip to the Soviet Union. He said no, and it would never occur to Stern to go to a government agency with any information, even though he is a patriot. There are professionals for spying, but under the Soviet system, every citizen is made to engage in espionage to humiliating and inefficient effect. But I feel like, I mean, this is about someone else, but I feel like in the case of Theremin, it's not really like he's just some random guy, you know, it's exactly. Like an incredibly valuable asset.
The idea that it's ridiculous and like evil that if a Soviet delegation goes overseas and they hang out with a Rothschild, that like the KGB would be like, yo, like what's
and
that
what
Rothschild
could an
guy
artist
saying?
Possibly tell that? Like, it's ridiculous. Like, they're like, yeah, all artists. It's again this sort of like weird thing around art where it's like, oh, artists only care about art, and they're like literally can't even hear what Rothschild is saying if it's not about art or something like that. You know, like.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you would have conversations about all kind of things, and like honestly, the artists are some of the best intelligence assets. I think once again it gets mixed up between like, you're saying there were literally CIA officers who like clocked in at Langley when they got back and like filed a report. Like, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that they use like famous people as assets sometimes. In fact, you see that, like, you totally see that throughout the Cold War with like Clark Gable and people like that, you know, Audie Murphy, who became a big kind of celebrity movie star. Like, people were engaging in like political activities and stuff like that, and also engaging in like propaganda activities. Like, you shouldn't even have to make an argument that like really famous people, who the most powerful people in society want to hang out with, because that's what they do, you know, would have no utility to an intelligence agency. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, he had like all these connected like millionaire families practically like eating out of his hand. Like, you don't think that would be some? Yeah, you're right. He's not a normal guy. Like, this guy is a singular kind of inventor. So naturally, he would be a valuable resource. And on top of that, also this thing of like, oh, every Soviet citizen is like beaten down and like just told like, you better go spy now, you little pig, like, and come back and like tell everything, or you're gonna go fucking gulag. Like, I think in his case, he was always like a patriotic like Soviet citizen and like Soviet scientist. And it sounds like, even, you know, 50 years later, that he was very like committed to that ideology. He didn't even necessarily try to hide he was not necessarily posing even as like a Soviet dissident, right? Like, maybe he was kind of posing that he was doing this to make money, like coming to New York to make money and capitalize on his great thing. But I think there was at least a dual purpose there of like, I'm going to help my country out. And this book does mention elsewhere, again, in very ominous tones, that like Lenin himself had devised this strategy, that he was going to send out like talented scientists and engineer type people that could, you know, go and work in like Western corporations, and as opposed to like worker spies, which I guess they had a distaste for, because like, I don't know, having somebody in the company like be a factory, like an assembly line worker, and then like try to steal documents, like those people don't know what they're looking for. You need to get people that are experts and that like have good reputations and stuff to go overseas and do that. And then of course also like what he wrote earlier, that you know, it's funny that like, who's the real job creator? Like all these like American tradesmen like beating down the doors to like get sent to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
During the Great Depression. But like, they did do that, and they hired like engineers to come over that had worked for things like Ford or other big companies to help them industrialize very, very fast. And so there, you know, it was going on in like both directions. Like, they had some Soviet scientists over in America that were gleaning whatever information, and also just human intelligence from these elites. You know, I mean, since he's hanging out in these lefty milieus, he's also getting a sense of like, you know, the ruling class of America, like what are the battle lines in terms of anti-Soviet sentiment, or like pro-Nazi sentiment, or, you know, potential sympathy towards the USSR and things like, because this was like a strange popular front period. I think anybody that I don't know, did you see Oppenheimer?
No.
I mean, it's whatever as a overall thing, but I was surprised going to see it that it's like the theme of like everybody being a communist in the 30s was like such a prominent theme of the whole movie, and it's all framed around him getting kind of smeared as like a fellow traveler communist, you know, during McCarthyism. And it ultimately has a very liberal thing. I mean, it literally like the bad senator who's like trying to own him gets like owned at the end, and it's like, the vote just came in from this young guy from Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy. It was a no. Like, you're not going to be Secretary of Defense. And everyone's like, oh, like America's back. Like, it had that kind of, that was kind of funny. But the first part of it was all about.
That's really funny. All right.
But they showed more of that, of just like how many communists, including Oppenheimer, was definitely sympathetic. Like, and there were other, you know, people associated with that project that definitely spied like for the Soviets and like passed on information and things like that. I mean, I think Julius Rosenberg, but then even beyond that, that were genuinely sympathetic to like the Soviet cause. at that time. So this is like a weird decade before like the Red Scare thing really locks down after the war. And, there definitely probably wasn't any future for him, after World War II. But during World War II, another interesting thing is like he's not just making little like tinker toys like when he's in the science gulag. He's making some like cutting edge shit, including I think he makes the first bug microphone, right? Like he invents the first kind of wireless bug microphone.
I don't know if it was the first, maybe. I'm not sure. I know that he invented something that was like a special type of listening device that was like, really valuable because it was one of the first covert listening devices.
You're talking about the Thing.
Yeah.
It is called the Thing, and this is some legendary kind of espionage shit that Theremin himself like pulled off basically during the war. Yeah, so the Thing Soviet spy device, also known as the Great Seal bug,
yeah, because it was inside the Great Seal of the United States. They like gave it to them like as like a gift right after World War II.
Yeah. So actually, it even like it hits even better knowing that he was like befriending and hanging out with all these like super high society New York people, because this was a listening device that was ensconced in like a gigantic, like a seal of the United States, like this kind of red cast seal. There's a whole Wikipedia article about it that was presented by a bunch of Soviet school children on August 4th, 1945, to the U.S. ambassador to the USSR, W. Averell Harriman, who is like about, as like elite connected as one gets, right? Like I think Brown Brothers Harriman, the railroads, Rockefellers, everything, and was like the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II. A very sensitive position, but they gave it to him and they hung it in his office, and it stayed there for 7 years. I think until it was accidentally discovered by the British, who were like scanning radio waves or something. But I guess it was technically like a predecessor to RFID kind of technology. Like it had no power source of its own. It needed to have electromagnetic energy beamed at it to become active. So it consisted of a tiny capacitive membrane connected to a small quarter wavelength antenna with no power supply or active electronic components. The device, a passive cavity resonator, became active only when a radio signal of the correct frequency was sent to the device from an external transmitter. This is referred to in NSA parlance as, quote, illuminating a passive device. Sound waves, like from voices inside the ambassador's office, passed through the thin wood case, striking the membrane and causing it to vibrate. The movement of the membrane varied the capacitance seen by the antenna, which in turn modulated the radio waves that struck and were retransmitted by the Thing. A receiver demodulated the signal so that sound picked up by the microphone could be heard, just as an ordinary radio receiver demodulates radio signals and outputs sound. It was very difficult to detect, basically.
Yeah, and not only was it difficult to detect, like it could have basically like last forever because it didn't really have a power supply. And it was incredibly subtle and like small and basically, so it's like a very, very ingenious bug. But they did end up getting discovered because like some British radio station, or some British radio operator overheard an open Soviet Air Force radio channel, like transmitting American conversations because the Soviets were beaming radio waves to the office at that time. So then they figured it out.
1951, when George F. Kennan was ambassador, they kind of accidentally intercepted it, and then eventually that sort of led them to, with the assistance of the British Marconi Company of Titanic fame, and like the FBI, CIA, everybody else, they basically found it. And but I mean, that's actually crazy that the Soviets had a bug in the U.S. ambassador's office in their embassy for like almost 7 years, and the Americans had like no idea that it was there. Like that's quite an edge to have. I mean, I'm sure not every scheme and plot goes through the ambassador's office or whatever, but I'm sure quite a bit did. I mean, these were really heavy hitters. These were like the founders of the Cold War, like Harriman, Kennan, all these people. And imagine if that had gone on. Imagine if like the entire Cold War they still had that thing there, you know?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that like one spy bug could like change the entire course of history, but it could have. And this was like under like late Stalin too, and Beria, you know, when they were freaking out for no reason and like decided to, you know, make Eastern Europe like be all communist and like Soviet aligned and stuff. And we're like worried about Nazis and being stupid. You know, that's kind of how this book and others describe it. So that, I mean, that's some legendary shit right there. You know, I assume he designed other things as well, but that was like a major coup. And then I guess like you referenced earlier, as he referenced, he was eventually like let out of like the science gulag and then formally rehabilitated in 1956, I think, under Khrushchev's leadership. And then he kept working at the same like top secret laboratory, and then had some kerfuffles in the late 60s with, you know, people saying that is a weird, that's like almost like too on the nose Soviet that I don't even believe it. It's like electricity not for, you know, music, it for electrocution of traitor. Like, did a conservatory guy really say that? I don't know. But I guess, you know, Theremin himself said that he said it. So, you know, maybe he did. I don't know. But I mean, that's another one of those like weird L's that like the Soviets like took sometimes of just like kind of reflectively like banning something for being like sus and bourgeois that turned out to kind of like not be, you know.
Well, you can't be too careful sometimes, you know.
But I think they had reasons for vigilance at the same time. Like, and I think even like making sure that Leon Theremin didn't get flipped by all these silk toppers was probably like a prudent thing. And it sounds like Theremin, given the circles he was running in, like, and again, maybe he's like downplaying it, but it didn't sound like even to the end of his life. It's not like in 1992 he came out and was like, "Oh, the Soviet Union's evil. I was just lying the whole time. Like, you know, get my truth out before I die." That like they were, you know, he was like, like it was normal at the time. Like, given the fact that there was a war going on, that you would be like interred and not just be allowed to like run around and do whatever the fuck you want because like you were sorely needed to create like top secret devices to like help, you know, beat the Nazis. So I don't know. And then when they rehabilitate him, you know, it sounds like he was like low key, never fully condemned. Like, and that was like kind of a cover because Stalin, think about it, like Stalin wanted everyone to think that he had, in a fit of like excessive, you know, whatever, Stalin stupidly shot Theremin. Like it almost sounds like that's what the Soviet government like wanted everybody, including the Americans and the Nazis, to think, is that they killed Theremin. He's out of the game, but he was not out of the game, you know?
Right.
And like he was up in like the fact that they didn't, maybe if they had known Theremin was alive, they'd been like, the SEAL seems sus, we should investigate, you know? But they're like, oh no, like their one genius is dead, they killed him, so you know, nothing to worry about. I don't know, but. You know, then he lived like a pretty chill, like I guess quiet life after that until like the Soviet Union collapsed. He died in 93. He did get brought to Stanford because by that point there were all these synth lords in America, some of whom were directly like deeply inspired by Theremin's work. And yeah. Is there anything else about Theremin that you noticed?
I think I covered everything that I wanted to note. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just read his last thing from this interview because they ask, "Do you have a message now you would like to convey to the Western world?" He says, "What words?" This is 1991. "The only thing I wanted to ask, if it were allowed by the Soviet government, is that I be allowed to promote my instruments. You must make the impression that I was allowed to come here. It seems that there will be no punishment for me if you write in the newspaper about all that I've told you. I hope nothing will happen. We'll see what happens. The same with my invention. I want to stress to you that all this needs to be done in a disciplined way, and that when people will be asking about me in writing, about me, that all this be done in a responsible way. But if you write that I have said something against the Soviet government, and that I have said that it is better to work elsewhere, then I shall have difficulties back home. Parentheses, ironic laughter, the end." So I mean, I don't know where his heart really lied, but I think he was a Soviet patriot. And so this is where, we get into like the direct
Seems
kind
like
of.
he was definitely, even from that book, it seemed like he was definitely more comfortable in Russia and with Russians, even though like he, might have had personal experiences that he didn't feel positive about in both cases. But it seems like he certainly wasn't like someone who was, it seemed like there was almost some bitterness like in the musical community that he wasn't like an all-out like defector who was just constantly going on about how terrible.
There's like a cope
Soviet
there
Union was.
of like because he sided with he sided literally with Stalin, like unambiguously, like in retrospect, like that's exactly what he did. Like he went back to like fight with the Red Army and like create like top of the line surveillance equipment, like experimental microphones, like spy on the Americans and shit. And probably nobody wants to admit that they might have been duped by hanging out with Theremin, that like Theremin really was like, or maybe, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of cope going on. And I like at one point in this book, I think he like, didn't he say, oh, well, like Theremin's story is like of bouncing back and forth between like the two worlds for the most of his life. And like he said, not really. He spent like 10 or 12 years in New York, possibly on like an intelligence mission, and then went back to the Soviet Union and like stayed there for the rest of his life and only traveled outside of it, I think in the late 80s, like to France for some kind of like music conference or festival or something. So like he pretty much he like spent most of his life in Russia and was like a loyal Soviet patriot who was like decorated for his contributions and everything, and seemed literally loyal to in 1990, I feel like in August 1991, you could, if you were a Soviet citizen who was like a famous person, maybe there was, because of the instability, it was weird, but I feel like you could really pop off in ways that, you couldn't like 5 years prior. But it seems like he really doesn't want, like I don't know, his respect seems genuine. And like, I don't want this interview to be used to like make it seem like I'm bad-mouthing the Soviets. Like, not only would that cause me headaches in my personal life, but it seems like he genuinely, that's like kind of how he sees it. I mean, he would have every incentive in the world. Like, he had the red carpet rolled out for him at Stanford. Like, if he wanted to do the flip and, go anti-Soviet, that was definitely all the rage around that era. Just like how, our other gentleman, was always a theosophist at his core. I feel like Theremin was a Soviet at his core, and he'll never forget the smile on Lenin's face as he played the theremin and figured it out on his own.
I guess he actually did return to New York at one point, like later on.
What, like in the late 80s?
I think so, or maybe.
Yeah. When after Perestroika and everything started, there's actually a picture of him, I think, in this from the magazine article of him sitting next to another like Russian expat composer. And the other guy is wearing like Perestroika suspenders. Yeah, he's like, there's a picture here. While at Stanford, Theremin was reintroduced to renowned musician, music encyclopedia author Nicholas Slanimsky, who also hails from St. Petersburg. He also took time to read Slanimsky's suspenders, which say Perestroika in the Cyrillic alphabet. And he's kind of like, it's funny, it's like he's showing off these suspenders, and Theremin is just like staring with like absolute like a cold expression on his face, like fucking kind of just like examining it, like very not impressed. He didn't seem like excited about Perestroika necessarily, but really, interesting guy. And then there's still kind of a gap of time that exists before, basically the kind of the 1940s and the 1950s of like experimental electronic music. But I don't know. From everything I've read, I would argue that like the most direct influence that Theremin had was on the man who would eventually create the first analog synthesizer, Robert Moog, who was just an American guy. And maybe we'll probably talk about him next time, because we only have a little bit of time left here. But he started tinkering as a young man. He became like obsessed with theremins and started building them at home. And then I think he became, I don't know if it was for RCA or a different company. I think it was for RCA. He became like a theremin salesman for a while. or maybe was selling his own theremins that he was designing. But either way, like he...
I was just going to say that this is an amazing story that kind of indicates what you were saying that I just happened to stumble upon.
Okay.
So in 1991, a boyishly ecstatic Lev Sergeyevich, this is from the same book we've been reading from, waved his new Communist Party card at Bulat Galiev. Again, spring of 1991. Congratulate me. I have been accepted into the Communist Party at last. The card even had his picture on it. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong quest. His first try on the eve of his trip to Europe and America in 1927 had been denied. In the United States and later in Kolyma and the Sharashkas, it was impossible. After my liberation, I was not trusted for a long time, he recalled, but he was tenacious. He had enrolled at the University of Marxism-Leninism and earned a diploma there in 1981. Then he reapplied to the party. Maybe now I could be accepted. But a bureaucrat rejected him on a technicality. He found some paragraph in the rules of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that prohibited a person from entering the party after the age of 80. As it turned out, he explained to Galiev, it was possible. The inveterate Bolshevik could finally validate his life's path, even if retroactively. But why do you need it now, Galiev asked, now when everyone is trying to flee them? Lev Sergeyevich scoffed. What a question! Let them run. I promised Lenin I would do it. His ironic sense of timing had surfaced again. Within months of posing for his picture on the card, he watched 10 republics from the Baltic, Central Asia, Trans-Caucasia, and the European USSR peel away and declare their independence from the Soviet Union.
No.
Woof.
But no, okay. Yeah, he was a patriot. Yeah, exactly. Like he was a fucking patriot, and right up to the end, wow. Like, I don't know, incredibly based compared to everybody else who was like a sus fascist, like futurist, like obsessed with theosophy. I didn't see anything in this book that indicated like a spiritual or spiritualist kind of interest with Theremin, right?
Not in the same way that there was with Rasoli. It doesn't seem like that was really his objective in the same way. I think that there was something like that could broadly be described spiritual for him about it. Yeah, like at his final
utilizing electricity to like create new kinds of music that like anybody, including Lenin, can like.
Yeah,
you know, it's got the same optimism as like Lenin creating like chess clubs in like every factory because like he wanted like working class people to like learn how to play chess so they too could be like masters of like the world.
This book actually has like a pretty fitting like send off for him, you know, that I think is indicative or kind of encapsulates his sentiments in some way. Like it says it has no epitaph on his tombstone, you know, when he died in 1993, and it says it may just be that he left his own epitaph, not in words but but characteristically in the aether. At his final public performance, he summoned the waves one last time with old knotted quavering hands at the Hague Museum. He intoned a Russian children's song of the Soviet epic. It was not a summation, for he never looked back but only toward the future. Circle of the sun, the sky around it. It is the picture of a little boy. He has drawn on a sheet of paper, and in the corner he has written, "Let the sun shine forever. Let me be forever."
Wow.
Yeah.
Theremin GB. Theremin lives. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, there's one more thing about Theremin, though, that is just, in terms of maybe spiritual roots, that comes so randomly in this book, but I feel like I have to mention it because it connects to something else. But this is actually like chapter 1, Soviet Power plus Electrification, which has, I'd love to see the actual source for this quote, but this is what he puts to start the chapter. Electricity will take the place of God. Let the peasant pray to electricity. He's going to feel the power of the central authorities more than that of heaven. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1918. Like, I don't know.
Is there a footnote?
Okay, maybe he said that. That's like the quote leading the chapter. Basically, is that, did Lenin say that? Was he joking? I don't know. Anyways, this has a wild twist right here. He starts, homes were searched and thousands of citizens were seized and rounded up without warning by lieutenants, sergeants at arms, spies, and other informants. In jail, the will of the arrested was quickly worn down by hunger and lack of sleep. Legal counsel was denied them, and they would never learn the identity of their accusers. They were usually quick to admit their alleged crimes at a tribunal. If not, any attempts at self-defense were met with draconian measures, including torture, to exact a confession of guilt, the only admissible verdict in the end. Punishment was life imprisonment or execution. In either case, the goods and property of the convicted were confiscated, condemning their descendants to a life of penury. Such was the fate of the Albigensian sect of the 12th and 13th centuries, routed in southern France by a bloody inquisition. The Albigenses were heretics who denied the veracity of Christ's redemptive power, the authority of the Pope, and the teachings of the Roman Church. They believed only in the constant struggle between good and evil. They preached that human souls, like Satan, had been cast out of...
basically?
Yes.
Why?
But wait, there's a twist, though.
All right.
Purification of the soul at death, they preached that human souls, like Satan, had been cast out of heaven for rebelling against God and had been condemned to imprisonment on earth in physical bodies. Purification of the soul at death was their single goal. Any worldly perpetuation of the race, marriage, procreation, or any material want was to be shunned. Suicide by starvation was encouraged in anyone who had reached a pure or perfect state, and those who were still impure at death were thought to transmigrate to a lower life form. The killing of animals was therefore forbidden, and meat and dairy products were thought to be contaminated. The Inquisition left the Albigenses' homeland, the province of Languedoc, near Toulouse, virtually cleansed of their sect at the end of the 14th century. A scattered few managed to escape, and among them was a group bearing the name Theremin, a name that translated literally as bath attendant, a Christian metaphor, ironically, for the cleansing of the soul. Reinventing themselves, the group adopted the metaphor literally and converted to Christianity as Huguenots, only to suffer persecution under the French monarchy in the 16th century. But their iron resolve sent them fleeing where they had to, repeatedly adapting for survival. They fanned out to Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Prussia, and in 1793 to St. Petersburg, where a Russian branch of the family was established. The generations of Theremins that followed were a diverse lot. One offshoot flowered into a line of Protestant priests. Some became rebels, storming the Bastille and fighting in the American Civil War. Still others were artists, musicians, and professors, and a few distinguished themselves in law and medicine. One family member had been blessed by Calvin himself, while his brother was slaughtered in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. The Theremin family history was laden with leitmotifs: war, persecution, flight, emigration, spiritual fortitude, encounters with the nobility, disdain for material pursuits, artistic excellence, scientific and philosophical inquiry, and, above all, the perpetual interplay of good and evil. Tumbling down through the generations, these manifold fortunes and the whole familial legacy of the sacred and the profane, the victorious and the tragic, would eventually be the single inheritance of one extraordinary individual, set apart in every way, even by his earliest recollection. Quote from Theremin, "I remember myself before my official birthday. There was complete darkness. Something was always turning, and it seemed to me I was falling into a neighboring place. I remember sounds gradually becoming louder, and at the end I saw a little red spot start to get bigger and bigger, brighter and brighter, and suddenly it was so big that my eyes were hurting. I was afraid. The spot changed color from red to white. Something began to push me from behind, and it finally pushed me out. The light was so bright that I tried to close my eyes. There were so many sounds around me. That was the day of my birth." The day was August 15th, 1896, by the old-style Julian calendar. It was St. Petersburg. The boy's father, Sergei Ilyich Theremin, a graduate of St. Petersburg University and a respected lawyer, was the son of the Tsar's court physician. Sergei's wife, Yevgenia Antonova Orzhinskaya, part Polish and part Russian, was of noble birth and liked to dabble in music and the arts. The boy remembered, "I was held in someone's hands. Now I know it was my father. Everyone around me was talking loudly. Then I was put down. It was cold. Now I know it was cold water. It was my baptism." All right. That's so he's like apparently Leon Theremin is like an Albigensian.
Interesting. Okay.
Who remembers being born. I mean, that's a little like mystical. It's technically like not kind of like supernatural,
it also just
but
kind of reminds
mystical.
me of like the sort of personality that Russians sometimes have, though. Having lived in Russia for a little bit, I feel like that type of like that kind of quote unquote mysticism is weirdly normal, not to like culturally
I know what you mean.
generalize.
There's like kind of a folk, like an ambient folk
like
mysticism.
that guy who we were talking to one time who said that the Soviet space program was about escaping humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
We want to escape our humanity.
Dude. Yeah, express it like very poetically. I feel like that is just fairly.
The guy was
common.
a philosophy major and then like a rocketry engineer. Like he like double majored in like philosophy and rocketry or something.
Well,
but it's like that. That is a vibe, I think. And so even when like, I feel like even when you have these like Russian scientists, I think we saw a little bit of that in our Soviet parapsychology episode, that there's quite a bit, even in an officially atheistic society, that kind of like, for lack of a better word, like folk mysticism, even among like committed like Marxist Leninists and stuff, was oftentimes like kind of there floating around in the background. And I think next time we'll talk about
speaking of Soviet mysticism, I was just tracking down that quote about electricity becoming the new god. That apparently was a quote from Lenin, from Leonid Krasin, who was like a big Soviet finance guy, actually. He was the first Soviet ambassador to France. Then he was ambassador to London. He was a close friend of Lenin, and close collaborator with him. He apparently was like one of the big architects of, maybe not literal architects, but like someone who really campaigned for a monument containing Lenin's corpse. That would become a center of pilgrimage, like Mecca. And
interesting.
Yeah, he wrote an
article. Which Lenin didn't want, right? Lenin didn't want that, right? At least.
I'm not sure if he ever expressed it. I really don't know. But he wrote an article right away called like the immortalization of Lenin. And like he attempted to preserve him like cryogenically. This is a quote that is on his Wikipedia page from a speech that he gave at a funeral of another person, Lev Karpov, Russian chemist, Bolshevik. He said, "I am certain the time will come when science will become all-powerful, that it will be able to recreate a deceased organism. I am certain that the time will come when one will be able to use the elements of a person's life to recreate the physical person. And I am certain that when that time will come, when the liberation of mankind, using all the might of science and technology, the strength and capacity of which we cannot now imagine, will be able to resurrect great historical figures. And I am certain that when that time will come, among the great figures will be our comrade, Lev Yakovlevich." So I guess he imagined Lenin in the same way.
Lenin lives, literally.
That he would like eventually like come back to life. Yeah.
Lenin will live, just like Mayakovsky said.
Like all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about like the kind of instability of like the great Soviet atheism before. In fact, I've been thinking about like our episode on V throughout this entire episode as well, because
me too.
It reminded me of that, the conflict that Gogol had with I forget his name, but the sort of socialist critic who, when Gogol published his correspondences, his select correspondences, he like became outraged that
they got into a flame war, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, does the person who wrote Revizor, the government inspector, to the same person who wrote that, like, could you really praise the Russian Orthodox Church? And was like
that's right, he went post left and got
became
canceled.
Like a rage Wojak because Gogol said like words of praise for Russian Orthodoxy. We were talking kind of about the kind of instability of this like idea of like atheism and the religious aspects of the Soviet system. Kind of just musing on that in that episode. So I feel like that's relevant here as well.
No, for sure. And we'll see it like remain relevant because like the Soviets, I think next time when we get into, I think we'll probably start next time from like basically World War II, and I think next time also we're gonna be more directly focused on the technology itself and like the people that created it, as well as like the first practitioners of like making this type of music, like the musique concrète. I definitely like to dig a little more into Halim Eldab. I don't know if you.
Oh yeah, I listened
to
some of his music. Yeah, I read
pretty cool, honestly. The Wire recorded piece from 1944 is an early example. Not quite electronic, but people in this time started manipulating with both, one big innovation of World War II, I think from Nazi Germany, the tape recorder, and also like microphones and like staggering different things. A little bit was going on in the late 30s as well, with people like John Cage, I think right in 1939. But actually, no, we didn't get to talk today about, there were some interesting, there are a couple other interesting Soviet experiments in like drawn sound in the 30s, but also there was a pretty infamous Nazi synthesizer that was embraced by the Nazi party. In fact, there are like pictures. I think this is the Großtonorgel. There's pictures of Joseph Goebbels playing it at like an exhibition, and it was sponsored, I think, by the what is it called? Like the Strength Through Joy kind of youth program of Nazi Germany. That's an interesting thing to talk about. But then, Halim El-Dab, who actually like not only is an early pioneer of this like kind of ambient music, but circles back around in the 50s to something we're going to start talking about next time, the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center.
Yeah.
And this is like a little known, but this is where we start, like the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of electronic music per se, like emerging as a distinct kind of genre, though it's like very experimental and not well defined yet. And honestly, the types of synthesizers that started to exist, you know, like in the early 1950s, they're like the computers of that time. They take up like an entire room and have like a ridiculously convoluted process by which they work. They're kind of like Rube Goldberg machines, and very limited like adoption potential, like either commercially or in contrast, ironically, in contrast to like the Theremin, the great Soviet invention, which is almost like the AK-47 of like electronic instruments, because you literally just like whip it out and can like move your finger around and start playing with it, right? You know, it's like it has an extreme simple like elegance and like utility to it that I would say like the early synthesizers, until Moog comes around, they really didn't have. I think next time we're also going to talk about a guy that we brought up on one of our earliest episodes, though I wasn't really aware of his significance. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, right?
Oh, yeah, you were sending me... I was remembering that article. You sent me an article about him. I was remembering that, yeah.
I believe we mentioned him in the Urantia episode, because he eventually became obsessed with the Book of Urantia.
Episode that we first talked about him for some reason, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, because like Urantia was like number 6.
Yeah,
that was super early. But I think he might have come up in LaRouche too, in all that classical music discourse.
Remember, yeah.
Did LaRouche think Stockhausen was like a sicko Malthusian?
Maybe, I'm not sure.
I feel like he'd be inclined to, because he loves.
I felt like it was the LaRouche episode, but yeah, I don't know. I felt like maybe he was into Verdi tuning or something, but maybe it was a totally different episode that, you know. But I felt like it was a little bit later than Urantia, maybe.
Yeah, but he got into some early this is kind of the German connection to it all. It's like you have a few different countries that are really kind of clanging away at it, like around the World War II, early 50s era, and France and Germany both have their own schools of like sort of experimental composition that increasingly starts to like pick up on these like very still pretty rudimentary kind of synthesizer prototypes. And also like back then it really was like a research institute or like Bell Labs or somebody like that would sort of have one like in their facilities or something, or maybe a little later a university would have one, but we're still far away from like the era of musicians being able to like buy one and like take it home with them, you know, or travel around with it.
Yeah.
That would not happen until really.
Before we wrap up, there's two things I really want to read. I really wanted to read this one quote from the book I was mentioning a little bit earlier that I was recommending. It's not directly related to this. I do want to read one thing that is related. I felt like I'm not sure, you know, I had mentioned it and I'm not sure when else it would come up, but, you know, I had mentioned it, and if I don't do it now, like I might, forget to read it, and I feel like it's just so SJ that it's like too perfect. It's from that book Artaud and His Doubles. I think it speaks to kind of the conversation we were having earlier, and also like other conversations we've had in the past. This paragraph is mostly about Lukács. I hope I'm saying that right.
Lukács?
Yeah, Lukács. His destruction of reason, but the way that this author puts it, Kimberly Janaron, the way that she puts it is, I think, very good. She writes, George Lukács argued in his controversial Destruction of Reason that thinkers have to be examined in light of their social, political, and historical significance, whether or not the authors deliberately position themselves in these categories. Their ideas have historically necessary influence. In this sense, every thinker is responsible to history for the objective substance of his philosophizing. That's a Lukács quote. This resulted in his famous examination of Nietzsche, which attempted to uncover, quote, how philosophical formulations as an intellectual mirroring of Germany's concrete development towards Hitler helped to speed up the process of Germany's path to Hitler. Lukács argued that the accusation of pedigree hunting pales in significance to the importance of tracing a web of thought subtler than superficial alliances. Explicit declarations, dedications, temporary allegiances, all these are visible to the most casual observer. What is more difficult is to see how fascistic structures of thought manifest themselves among the intellectuals, artists, leftists, and quote-unquote ordinary people who, throughout the 20th century, have found themselves part of a totalitarian world and have no idea how they arrived there. First of all, I think, this sort of clap back to the critique of quote-unquote pedigree hunting is good, but I also think that's, like, a very important point that, like, the issue of pointing out these aspects of intellectual history, it's so valuable because when we see, like, it, if we sort of pave over like the problematic or uncomfortable history of like the people who have been so influential in art and culture and things like that, and the theory of art, then we lose consciousness of how things like fascism even happened, and it becomes invisible to us. So
absolutely,
I think,
absolutely.
And on that point, I wanted to also read this because I feel like we didn't talk about this, and this is a great anecdote that Chessa uses to open her book on Russolo, and I feel like this is worth reading because it's, I love these type of anecdotes, and I think it's a great one. On a summer evening, the Russolos were entertaining a guest when Russolo, pleading fatigue and sleepiness, went to bed. The lady and the guest continued chatting for a little longer until she, the good knight said, retired. While ascending the internal staircase, her gaze was attracted upward, something that had never happened to her. It was then that she saw a kind of white ghost appearing at the banister of the landing, and quickly recognized his familiar face. It was Russolo, leaning on the banister, all illuminated by the full moon. His wife gazed at him amazed and asked what he was doing and why he was standing there so calmly and wrapped up in his white nightshirt. He did not respond, nor did he move. Alarmed by his silence, Madame Russolo descended the few steps to call on the guest so that she could be reassured that this was not an illusion. But at their return, the white vision had disappeared. She felt humiliated and almost offended by the teasing of her guest, who treated her as a visionary. They quickly entered Russolo's room and found him deeply asleep, calm, breathing very regularly. In silence, they left. Later, rethinking the incident, the wife was not able to convince herself that it had been a hallucination. The morning after the event, Madame Russolo recounted the scene to her husband, who, with evident satisfaction, asked, "Ah, do you really say? You saw me, actually in that state? But then I have finally succeeded. I have obtained the doubling of my body. That which you saw, you really saw it. It was my etheric body, perhaps coming to see you go up to your room, while my physical body lay inert in bed. Good, good. I am more than happy about this. But I pray you, don't tell this story to anyone now. The reasons for silence are obvious, and you understand them by yourself." The preceding paragraphs are a verbatim translation of an anecdote that Maria Zanovello, the widow of the futurist Luigi Russolo, recounted in the third person in the biography of her husband that she published after his death. Her experience can confidently be dated to the late 1930s, years the Russolos spent in Cerro di Laveno, a small and idyllic northern Italian town on the shores of Lago Maggiore. Surprising as it may seem, this account was not the result of Russollos's wife's fevered imagination. Rather, it can be directly linked to Russollos's writing and practices at the time, as the following passage from his 1938 book, Al di là della materia, exemplifies. By continuing the process of magnetizing a subject, once the phase of exteriorization of sensibility has begun, the layers of sensibility around the subject becomes larger and larger in concentric layers that gradually condense in two masses, one on the left, colored in orange, and one on the right, colored in blue. These two masses soon connect, and they are attracted one by the other. The right one, usually passing from behind the subject, reunites with the left one. These two masses, now joined, take a shape vaguely resembling a human body a little bigger than the subject's body, and that stays, at least at first, on its left. This form is connected to the body of the subject via a special tube or vapor-like cord about a finger in thickness, departing from the stomach region, solar plexus, and joining this vaporous mass at the same point. This is a true ghost, or as occultists call it, an etheric double. To follow the phases of this phenomenon, it is necessary that clairvoyance be present, or that a subject in a somnambulic state sees and describes the unfolding of the phenomenon. Other experimental tests have been run to ascertain the presence of this double. A screen of calcium sulfide becomes brilliant and luminous if this double, which one can also cause to move to a nearby room, passes over or near the screen. It is possible to cause this double to execute actions like moving light objects. It is, in short, something resembling the apparitions of ectoplasm that occur and have been photographed in seances such as those done by crooks. So, yeah, and the author goes on to say that, like, you know, many people consider that these, as we talked about, you know, these are the generation from his great work on synthesizers and, you know, early synthesizer, early electronic music and such things, early noise. But in fact, this wasn't actually too much of a shift in terms of his views. And rather than, as she writes, as one Hegelian critic put it, you know, abdicated the spirit of the avant-garde is actually very much true to the spirit of the avant-garde. And you can even see some of the resonances between his ideas about music, I think, that we discussed earlier, and the theory of this, or the sort of science of this etheric double that he's talking about here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, I mean, this technology has now brought to, like you said, I mean, capturing the voice of the dead and the image of the dead, and, you know, through video and audio technology is now, it's like in that Silicon Valley way of like materializing technologies that do what we would have previously regarded as like occult powers, like clairvoyance and all kinds of everything from like GPS technology to, you know, sending messages over electrical wires. I just want to read one more thing from that book that gets to like the purpose of music, kind of related to all of that, and the theosophical intersection. But they write that Besant and Ledbetter claimed that every time a composer writes music, his states of mind produce luminous projections in the aura around him. They name these projections thought forms. In the activity of interpretation, the player also expresses his own states of mind, which produce other thought forms. Moreover, the music produces sound forms, also referred to as, quote, forms built by music that, while similar to them, are not technically thought forms and therefore not projected onto the aura as thought forms are. Instead, they are projected onto the sky above the performance venue. Thought forms are, finally, produced by the audience as a spontaneous reaction to both the music and the forms. To complicate matters yet further, the thought forms of the musician and audience and the sound forms produced by the music itself can occur simultaneously, even if the thought forms do not have the power to interfere with the much more voluminous sound forms. So that's what's happening at Taylor concerts. Basically, the luminous projections of the aura around them, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's, you know, that almost gets at a kind of like a, you know, weaponized vibes, mind war kind of territory, if one wants to take it there, right?
Yes.
And as we'll see, I think maybe some people did take it there, though this is a very liminal case, I would say, where, you know, and I think the contrast of Russollot and Theremin is almost like a perfect encapsulation of that, where you have like this like off the wall futurist fascist like theosophist guy, and then you have like the ultimate Soviet patriot, Leon Theremin,
yes,
doing his thing. And they're both trying to push the boundaries like for their own reasons. So, I mean, I think we probably said
and it's
before
interesting
that
how they were both in a very similar domain with fairly different approaches, so there is like a connection between them or a nexus between them. But yes, it's, the approaches are very different. No, I think that's a good point. Like what you've just read, like that shows that there wasn't really this like break, and that's kind of like this. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. This like, down the line, like he went crazy and became a spiritualist, but there's usually like, in fact, in this case, there really is a very clear continuity that shouldn't be kind of cordoned off and abjected from the narrative here at all.
Yeah. And even I think the somewhat more materialistic approaches that, it's interesting. When we get to the 1950s, and next time we'll do a comparison of what people were doing in America at places like the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, and then what some of the Soviet composers and engineers were developing around the same time. All I'm going to say is you might be surprised which side the theosophist influence pops up on. But it's another interesting wrinkle in all of this, and we start to see almost to some degree like the development of analog synthesizers becoming one of the many technological races of the Cold War, though at the same time it's kind of liminal in that I think a lot of the people funding the development of these projects, from what I've read so far, based on sort of both sides, East and West, like the people funding it often didn't quite understand what it was or whether or not this would end up being a big deal, but there was like enough tantalizing kind of potential there that they kind of threw money in it. But I think we'll dig a little deeper and find out for sure like how deep, because there's a certain foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, that I noticed popping up like again and again, sponsoring this like early research into like synthesizers. And was that, were they just covering their bases or did they know something? But there are many different elements to that, including like the Musique Concrète and the Stockhausen schools in the 1950s, which really kind of fertilized like the soil for what would eventually come after that. But for now, I think we'll leave it there.
Word.
We at least made it to the 1930s.
Right. We had said like, I think we'll stop at the 60s. I had a feeling we weren't going to make it to the 60s.
Because there's a lot to cover, and it thickens. Each decade you go after World War II, more things start to develop in a more rapid fashion. And then, one day we'll finally get to our sus rave destination. But,
maybe the listeners appreciate that we didn't make this like a 12-minute song about the history of synthesizers. It's like an Animaniacs but based song, just reviewing the history of synthesizers in 12 minutes before going into the episode that we originally thought we were going to make.
That just means there's more episodes and there's more information.
There's no shortage of episodes. Yeah, I remember I forget who it was, but someone was like, "Are you going to run out of like stuff to talk about?" I was like, "No." No.
Not really.
No, it's not going to happen.
Fringe benefits. No, yeah. There's always something. Yeah. So I think this might be a 3, might be a 4. Who knows? Once we get all the way done with it, because the legacy, it's still going on. We're living in the age of electronic music, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no going back. To quote Juan Atkins, "There are no UFOs. Machine music is the only way forward."
Yeah.
Which we'll leave it there for now. But until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.